All right. I am joined by returning champ, past guest, friend of the show, Dr. Eric Osgood. How are you doing today, Eric?
Ben, great to be back with you. Thank you
Yes.
very much for inviting me back on.
Yeah, so figured we've let this series of Thursday Night Debate Breakdowns go into hiatus for a while for a lot of reasons. With scheduling, but trying to, getting it back starting tonight. Going to make it a regular feature again, have a bunch of stuff lined up for the next several weeks, but figured we should start with this one just because it's like probably the sort of most notable thing in our corner of
Sure.
Of media that's happened since we stopped doing these. And I thought it'd be really fun and interesting to do it with you, both because it's always good to talk to you and because you're the person who, kind of brought this to my attention. This was happening in the first place, but also because I think just before this happened, you had called in to the Majority Report to talk about not this. I think maybe like it wasn't public that this debate was going to happen at that time. If I'm getting my time.
It was no, it was. They had talked about it.
Okay.
It was a discussion about it had to do, and I kind of gave you a shout out because it had to do with that debate about whether Peter Hotez should debate RFK. And it turned into a broader discussion about how to kind of take on fundamentalists and some of the pitfalls that I see people on the left sometimes fall, kind of strategies for how to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually just listened to that call again while I was washing dishes before we went on air, and I mean it's maybe actually worth before we start up on Emma and Tim. Just kind of recapping a little bit because some of this is going to be relevant to what we're going to watch. So basically, I don't know, this time all blurs together. A couple months ago, something like that. There had been this brouhaha about Peter Hotez, who is a scientist and science popularizer and somebody who spent a lot of time sort of debunking anti-vax conspiracy theories, who had been on the Joe Rogan show before. And then after RFK Jr. was on the show, Hotez, posted about, a lot of the stuff that, he said was inaccurate, from what RFK Jr. had said on Rogan, and then Rogan, basically responded by, challenging him to come on and debate RFK Jr. on the show. Now, my position was, I wrote an article for the Daily Beast about it, which you mentioned in the call, was that I think he should have done it. I think it's sort of like that, somebody has to, that there's sort of no, my position on this has been that, like, just kind of hoping that, like, not dignifying it with a response, or, have not, like, sort of engaging with people who say things like this, that's kind of shutting the barn door after all the animals have run out, that at this point this stuff is out there and is popular to an extent where you just can't do that anymore, right? So and then other people, including, I should say, I think the sort of consensus view on the Majority Report was no, he shouldn't. It's and they have their whole critique of doing things like that. And then you had a kind of view where you thought that, like, in between those, right? I mean, I'll let you speak for yourself, but I mean, I think your position was that he should agree to it, but only with certain preconditions, or like maybe, in general, people should agree to it, but only with certain preconditions.
Yeah, exactly. and yeah, and one of the reasons I agree with that, Peter Hotez had spent a lot of time writing articles about how we need modern day scientists to become more sort of skilled as sort of the gift of gab, the ability to kind of mix it up and debate, get out there, including modern forms of communication, such as like podcasts and things like that, and take these claims on. And then to be, so I don't know if you ever watched Curb Your Enthusiasm, where there's an episode where somebody spills a drink and a woman's like, "Oh, someone get a napkin," and Larry David's like, "Why don't you get it?" Like, it kind of reminded me of that. Like, someone's got to get out there and do this. Hey, do it. Well, no, someone else do it. Like, I mean, you're like Peter Hotez, you're the guy that's been writing very enthusiastically, and one of the things I really like about him, about how we need scientists to stop taking that approach of, no, we're up here in an ivory tower and these people are beneath us and we're not going to engage with them. And no, like, these claims are having influence on people. It's causing adverse health outcomes. That's something I've seen personally throughout a lot of 2021 when I would do like these telehealth appointments for people that were having a lot of hesitancy and fears about getting vaccinated, but like they wanted to, but they were reading all kinds of material scaring them away. And I had like appointments where I would sit with people and I would have to like address claims by like RFK or like some of the other guys like Peter McCullough and some of the other people that were popularizing a lot of sort of bad information. And I saw people like potentially harmed where it was like, oh yeah, I want to go get it. I'm 67 years old and I have diabetes and high blood pressure and I've had 5 heart attacks and I have 10 stents. But my son told me that RFK Jr. said I'm going to have this problem if I get the shot. And like, I think getting out there and mixing it up with people making these kinds of terrible claims is important if you actually have like humanistic principles and you care about harm reduction, because there is societal value in making people like this look stupid in front of their own followers. And I've seen it done when done correctly. And so my point was, in terms of a debate, when you think about, okay, you have a moderator and like, here's one candidate and there's the other, and here you've got 5 minutes to speak. And then here you've got a minute for rebuttal and back and forth. I didn't think that formulation of debate would have much value because it would just be a bunch of gish gallop and noise. And I think when the dust settled, no one would really get much out of it. I think you basically, because the people making these claims are usually the ones claiming no one will debate them, and they'll go on with anyone and talk in any format, to kind of put it to them to say, look, I'm going to give you an opportunity to defend some of the claims that you've made, and we're actually going to address your claims, and you're going to have to present some science to back it up. And myself, who has the ability to actually appraise the science that you're presenting, is going to engage with you on your claims. And when you do it that way, it kind of takes away the ability to do that sort of gish galloping and jumping all over and just kind of riffing and just poisoning the well with so much nonsense that it's hard to debunk it all. When you actually make people defend their claims, you can get a lot out of it, and you can actually end up making someone look pretty foolish. And again, I think there's societal value in that when someone has a huge platform and they're putting information out there that's causing harm. And I think there's an obligation to do it when you have the calling to do so.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense to me. And I also think that like whatever the sort of, preconditions that Hotez could have asked for, there's a, discussion to, I think there are like pros and cons to different ways of doing it, that that like, I can understand saying, oh, I want a more neutral platform, than the Joe Rogan Experience. On the other hand, we are talking about the most popular podcast in the world where people have already been exposed at length to these views, right?
Yeah.
But like whatever preconditions he'd asked for, I also think it would have just been a much better look if he had said, yeah, I'll do it, but only under conditions X, Y, and Z. And let's say RFK had said no or had just ignored it or whatever, right? Like it still wouldn't have given them that ammunition that
I agree. Yeah.
I
agree.
Yeah.
And like the biggest point I made on that call was that when you're going to do this kind of thing, you need to get both parties to agree to a pre-debate data exchange, which is kind of analogous to like pre-trial discovery when you go to court, where any scientific literature or any kind of scholarly work that you plan to cite during this debate, you need to send me these links ahead of time so I have a chance to look at them, because I talked a little bit about how the sort of the misuse and abuse of scholarly articles when they just sort of cite bad literature, or sometimes will miscite findings, or there's also, and so if you're gonna just start throwing stuff studies around and saying, well, here's why I'm right. This study showed that. I want to have a chance to look at what you're going to throw at me ahead of time. So that if it's a crap study and I don't have the ability to debunk that in real time, I've seen people, whether on the left or just kind of on the center, sort of pro-science, get tripped up in debates with kind of like the fundamentalist right types, because they'll throw a study. They'll say, oh, well, you know what? This study published in this journal show that no, that's not the case at all. And then they end up kind of resorting to just kind of meandering around or kind of appeals to emotion. And it's better to actually be able to say, oh, okay, that's the study that you're citing. Here's why that study is complete crap and why there's much better research proving that you're wrong. But you can't, it's almost impossible to do that if you haven't had a chance to actually look at that research ahead of time. And I think a pre-debate data exchange, you'll end up getting people like RFK and people in that ilk running away from it. They're not going to agree to that because they know what they're citing is garbage. And if they don't have an ability to just flood you with it in real time, they know that their goose is kind of cooked.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think especially in a subject like this one, I think that makes sense. I mean, honestly, with any subject, the most annoying thing for like to either do or watch people do is get information like live on air and like try to like, you know, spend 30 seconds like really quickly on the fly figuring out whether it's true or not. I mean, that's kind of a waste of everybody's time. Right. So, I definitely feel that. Okay, let's go to Tim and Emma. This is actually going to be my first time watching it all the way through. I've seen a number of clips from it since it happened, and I know that they cover a lot of material and a lot of different subjects over the course of this. I mean, obviously. Obviously my bias in this is clear enough. As the Emma Vigeland is an actual, not in the shitty way that I often use this phrase, but an actual friend of the show, and I think I tend to think Tim Pool is a pretty repugnant piece of shit, but he's, all at the same time. Look, I'm sure if I watched like 2.5 hours of myself from a couple months ago, there'd be stuff I would disagree with, so I can try to call balls and strikes as it comes up. But let's get started.
I'm back. First thing I want to say is thank you to Jack Posobiec and Seamus Coughlin for guest hosting Timcast IRL while I was out. I wasn't not, in fact, dead. I just lost my voice, and that really sucked. I think on Sunday I was kind of sick, and it sucked, so I just hung out and was playing video games all day. But then Monday I was talking like this, and then I figured I'd be fine by Tuesday, and then come Wednesday morning when I still couldn't talk, we were like, we need to call in the big guns. So we reached out to some people to see if they would guest host for us. And we got some people. We got Jack and Seamus. So thank you all for that. This is the first The Culture War podcast we're doing live, as we're now getting into the purpose for what this show is. When we do shows on Timcast IRL at 8 or so p.m., we'll often have people come in who are either disagree with us on certain issues, and or that's primarily it. When they do, the show transforms from topical news into political and cultural debate. And so we decided we need to make a specific show that just handles those conversations and expands upon them so that we can actually get to the core of what people think, feel, why they want certain policies and why they don't. And a topical news show doesn't really work for that. So Friday mornings, here's what we're going to do. And we were posting this at 1 p.m. Before, but now we'll probably end up doing it live just because. So without further ado, without wasting any of your time, we've got two awesome guests. Sean, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Oh, I'm Sean Fitzgerald. I do YouTube at The Actual Justice Warrior. I cover primarily criminal justice related issues, and I'm happy to be here for your maiden live voyage of the Culture War.
And Emma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Emma Vigeland. I'm the co-host of The Majority Report. Thanks so much, Tim, for having me on. I know that it was a little dicey with you and Sam in terms of him coming on. But I'm happy that you had me on.
Absolutely, I'm glad you came.
Yeah,
you know.
and it's. I just want to clear this up because I know that you didn't want to have Sam on because you called him a grifter, right?
Yeah.
And part of the reason that you called him that is because you said that we put your song through a filter on our show, and I just want you to know, I was hosting that day. We don't have the technology to do that, so I did not do that. So there you go.
Yeah, it was
clearing
like
that up for you.
the song. So that specific issue was the song we put out, played on your show, had like the mids ripped out of it.
We don't have the technological ability to do that. We're just a bunch of leftists with like a soundboard. I promise you, nothing was intentional.
You don't have Audacity; it's free.
Well, no, the issue here is likely
I don't really
that
know. I don't know anything about
if you don't have proper ingestion, then like the audio is going through a TV or something, it's going to sound really bad.
Right.
So if we were to like play music on the TV and then put the mics up to it, everything would be ripped out from it. And then if we were to say, look,
Matt, I really hope that at least an hour of it is spent arguing about this.
Yeah, seriously. Again, I mean, I guess in fairness to Tim, he's not necessarily wrong. Although I don't think it would have sounded really great no matter what you did with it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard worse. I think it's I think it's pretty mediocre, but anyway.
It's fine. Yeah. It's I don't want to make fun of someone trying to put themselves out there and say that.
No. I mean, I think it's nothing. I think it's kind of bland, but whatever, it's fine.
Yeah.
But let's keep going.
Listen how bad this sounds. It's misleading the average person,
right?
Thinking that's what the song sounds like. When
but I played that, and look, I mean, we're here to have a great discussion. I think, but it's interesting that even though I played it, that was your justification for calling Sam a grifter.
Oh, it's not though. The issue with Sam was that I put out a tweet where I said we try to invite people on the left all the time. They always say no, and then Sam tweeted challenge accepted or something to that effect, like I'll come on. And I was like, oh, this is great because, Sam was actually the first person to ever shout me out ever in my career.
Yeah.
Praising me. And so I said, we will cover travel and accommodation. We'll fly you out. We'll take care of everything. Let me know what day works for you. And he said something like the 13th. And I was like, this is fantastic. And then he DM'd me and was like, I'm not coming on your show. And I was like,
it was because of COVID restrictions. I've seen the DMs. I told him he should put it on. I've told him he should put it on Twitter, but he's too good of a guy. I mean, maybe. Well,
no, I published all the DMs.
Yeah.
Because then what he did was, he then it's mostly water under the bridge, but he made some comment about me backing out or something, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, and then I messaged him. I was like, "Are you kidding, dude? Like, we're going to pay for everything." And then he was just like, "No, I'm not doing it. Are you crazy?" Well,
then just do it. Like, I mean, I'm sure he'd be down to come down soon, and you guys could actually hash
the issue has expanded more than that. I mean, so at the same time, there was Hassan Piker, who also responded to my tweet, and he said, "I'd love to come." And I said, when can you come? And he said, let's figure out a date. And so I DM'd him and he said, I got to be honest, I'm actually concerned about COVID. And I said, totally get it. No worries, man. Thanks for reaching out. And that was the end of it. Sam, however, used it on like a video and then started tweeting about it because it was drumming up a whole bunch of clicks and views. And I'm like, okay, dude, I get it. Interacting with this guy is just going to create drama that he uses to get clicks. I mean, the dude's got like 170 videos about Dave Rubin.
Yeah, we do cover that. I mean, I think part of what we do is we try to respond to some of the right-wing ecosystem on the internet because there's a vacuum truly left. You guys have a lot more money than the left-wing media space. We just try to combat it a little bit.
I think the issue with that, I can understand why you'd say that, but it looks like this is a great way to kick off the show, actually, like the start of the culture war. I actually don't think whatever this space has more money because this is a fractured independent space of varying ideologies.
Tim, I'm in your compound right now.
Yeah, I'm rich.
I live in a one bedroom. I mean, how did you get rich?
I started a website, took memberships, sold ads on videos.
Yeah, but the reason that you get ads and that we don't is because you more adequately serve capitalism and we challenge it.
We get our ads pulled. What do you mean? There's whole organizations dedicated to getting all of our ads removed.
Right, but the proof is in the pudding and where I'm sitting right now.
So this is memberships. This is almost entirely because people pay to become members of our websites. If the Majority Report, you guys have been around a lot longer than I have. The inability to provide a product to a customer does not mean that one political faction has more or is granted more because of capitalism or anything like that. Like if Sam is unable to, I mean, Sam's had way more subscribers than me for a long, long time.
Right.
And he just like and I'm not saying this to be like mean. I'm saying if he doesn't know how to turn revenue, the issue is more so you need like a COO or somebody who's going to say, here's how we provide something to a market that generates revenue so we can expand our business. So we're better at that here, I suppose, is the easiest way to put it.
Well, no, because what you say here is more attractive to investors and advertisers. I mean, we're basically only members, and okay, well, other right-wing media like the Daily Wire and stuff like that, and even what I'm looking at the Rumble, what I don't know, what do you call that logo right there?
Looks like a rectangle.
Yeah, I mean that's a David Sachs, that's a venture capital backed venture, I believe. At the very least, Peter Thiel is involved and invested.
Wait,
there's no equivalent on the left.
Why wouldn't
Absolutely
you be able
not.
to get advertisers if like David Pakman and the Young Turks have advertisers? Your content's not like too
We do
dissimilar.
have advertisers. We just have, advertisers that are a little bit more within our system of values. And we're trying to combat corporate greed. We don't have a ton of advertisers that I think align with leftist, or we have advertisers that we try to include in terms of like leftist values as well. But just by the nature of left versus right, it's asymmetrical warfare. But honestly, Sam should just put
you're
put those
passing on
DMs out there.
advertisers that don't align with your values. So
Yeah.
like you have
we do the
those
same
options.
thing. We do literally say we have like 4 advertisers. We have
Right.
like 4.
Right. Okay.
So our website has no advertisers, and it's almost entirely membership funded.
Yeah.
So
I mean, look,
everything here is because people give us $10 a month.
We're really trying to cover politics on our program, and I think that that's what is like our central focus. I mean,
why make a video about me and music?
Well, I mean, it was a little fun because it was kind of funny. But I mean, Sam comes from a comedy background as well. I would say that I think you misrepresent what our show actually does. The first hour, the free hour of our program before we go to the membership portion, is one that we literally have experts on Social Security, on international politics. It's not honestly something that is conducive to it's dry. It's not conducive necessarily to a ton of capital investment or advertisers. And we're trying to make a difference in the world.
We don't have investment or we have like 4 advertisers. Actually, we have 0 advertisers. We got rid of them all.
Okay.
So we ended all of our advertisers. To be fair, on the podcast version of things, I think we have like 6. On the YouTube side of things, we've actually gotten rid of all advertisements. So now it's just like whatever YouTube does, they do.
Right.
And then we're starting our own companies. The reason we started our own coffee company, it's because I'm not going to say the name of this person, but there are organizations that lie in order to get our ads pulled. And so that's happened to us. One example is that there is, well, I don't get into too much of it, but there's a group that has argued that I have claimed that Donald Trump won in 2020, and they've used that to raise tens of thousands of dollars.
Okay.
I never said Donald Trump won in 2020. In fact, since Joe Biden got inaugurated, I said Trump lost, and these people need to accept it.
Right. Well, you said there might be a race war. There was that.
When did I say that?
I'm not sure, but you also said that.
I don't think that's a true thing.
The 10-year-old who got an abortion, who was raped, you call that a hoax. Have you retracted that statement?
So there's very deep context to that. What we're talking about when I say
that's been
hoax,
proven. I mean, charged. The rapist has been charged, and the doctor who provided the abortion fined.
So this is a really good example of the problem in the culture war, I would say. See, you don't know what I actually said, because I didn't say what you're describing.
You did. I just watched it last night.
Right. And so what I said was the fact that they politicized this to win a political point is the hoax, not that the child was abused.
How does that constitute a hoax, Tim?
So like, let's say there's what's a good example of this? Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery is a really great example, right? So here's
no, I'm talking about this example though.
Right,
one that I just brought up.
So right, if I can't explain to you that manipulating a story for political gain is the hoax, then I don't know.
What's the manipulation?
Oh man, this is an old story. I have to pull it up. I think the issue was that they were able to actually get the treatment in state, but because of the law, they decided to seek it elsewhere. And I said, that is a hoax. I didn't say that it was a hoax that the girl was abused. I said, if they could have sought treatment in state under the exemption, I think it was Ohio, right? There was an exemption saying in the cases of abuse, the treatments are permitted. but they decided to make a public statement and leave the state anyway. I said, that is a hoax.
It was not a public statement.
Well, but that's my point.
No, rape and incest exemptions are non-actionable. This is like well documented with abortion activists. How long do you think it takes to prove a rape or incest case before you're able to use that carve out to actually get an abortion?
Doesn't it depend on how the law is written? Do you have to prove it, or does it have to be alleged?
I mean, first of all,
let me just answer that point real quick so we can clarify the thing on.
Sure.
I never said it was a hoax that the girl was abused.
Okay.
That is incorrect.
But honestly, this is a part and parcel of what you do is you put that kind of statement out there and then you put caveats in to protect yourself.
Like
but
me saying that someone manipulating a story for political gain is a hoax.
It's not a manipulation. That is the kind of thing that's going to continue to happen as abortion restrictions happen throughout the country.
It
was a particularly egregious example used to shine light on broader restrictions on abortion in this country. I mean, it's an opinion, but you haven't retracted it. It's false.
It's not false. If there is a story and the story is exaggerated or manipulated in an effort to sway people into believing one political faction over the other, you are engaging in a hoax.
I mean, isn't that what you guys do when you post like extreme videos of crime and things like that?
We don't do that. What are you talking about?
I mean, you respond to videos that are taken completely out of context, isolated instances.
I don't think you watch the show because that doesn't sound
I mean, I do a little bit.
No, you don't. Because we don't do that.
Yeah. Yes, you do.
Well, that's not true because we don't do that. In fact, one of the points we make specifically is
you show subway crime to talk about these inflated crime numbers. Crime is down in New York City in 2023 by every metric.
Down compared to what?
Down compared to 2021 and
don't
2022.
Don't change the subject.
No,
right? You accused us of publishing videos we don't publish.
If it's down in compared to 2021, and there was a giant year-over-year increase from 2020 to 2021, then you're talking about something that's
it wasn't
down.
Giant. It was a small bump from the
pandemic. 47% increase in homicide in the city of New York is not a small bump.
It was homicides have been on a precipitous decline since the 70s, since the 80s, since the 90s. There was a bump because of desperation in the pandemic, and now it's back down in 2023. So, that's irrefutable. That's the NYPD's own data. That's on all major crimes: murders, rapes, grand larcenies, robberies.
This is an argument I'm often confronted with, and it's actually pretty terrible. So crime is down from the peak for sure, right? In some years in New York City, we had 2,100 murders. I think that's the largest ever in the history of the city of New York. However, my standard it's not as bad as the worst time in the history of the city of New York. When I see murders jump year over year from about 319 to 469.
What do you mean year over year? The 2 years that I just
year
listed?
Over year, as in from 2020 to 2021. That would be a year over year increase. That is a dramatic increase, and it's the largest since, I believe, 2010. The greatest year over year increase of all time in the city of New York, by the way. But it's all the way back to 2010 numbers.
It's down. Yeah,
it's down compared to the increase, but it's not down compared to 2019.
This was a once in a lifetime pandemic where people's desperation and their mental health was severely harmed. People were out of work, and that kind of desperation leads to more crime. That's the reality of how crime works. Poverty leads to crime. I would imagine.
Why do you think 25 people got shoved in front of trains last year?
I don't know, dude.
Well, that's a legitimate question. You're saying that you're saying poverty and desperation results in crime. I'm wondering why it is that you've had these homeless guys. They've been predominant. I think it's almost entirely these homeless guys shoving people in front of trains. Last year it was 25, and so that is.
So that's a mental health problem. I mean, we do have a mental health problem in this country. We have an issue with not having socialized healthcare, where people are unable to access healthcare, mental health care in particular, but also every other kind of healthcare. I mean, 28 million uninsured people in this country. That's a massive problem. I mean, what is your stance on Medicare for all and healthcare?
I'm for universal healthcare.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, I think we'd have to have some kind of like basic coverage for universal standard, meaning like if you're having an episode, this is particularly where we bring you in, we help you. If you're broken bones, flu, things that it's like relatively simple and knowledge based. The challenge with it is that we got limited space, we got limited doctors, but I don't think we can function as a society if we have people just dying in the streets like we do with drug abuse and
Well, then you should promote housing first policies.
Okay.
So the first bunch of that was kind of arguing about stuff that Tim had said in the past, or things that Sam and Emma had said about him. And, a lot of that, like, I think, look, a lot of that, I think that, like, Tim was being a little disingenuous about, like, like, I think it's pretty obvious that, like, the whole thing with Sam was that, like, Sam took, do you want to come on my show, as, encompassing the possibility of coming on through Zoom. And,
Right.
And that's, like, a pretty straightforward, like, I think Tim's being a little bit disingenuous about that, but, like, but putting that aside, it's like a lot of that is, like, kind of, a lot of that early stuff is not really that interesting to me, because it's, like, sort of, there's an element of, like, he said, she said about, like, what somebody said in the past. We're not watching it right now. Like, and that's not really what I'm most interested in hearing from these people about. Last part was really interesting. I want to pause here to give you a chance to weigh in on this, because I really liked this moment from Emma, where she took the sort of the subway crime claim and to talking about Medicare for all and mental health. And that, and I particularly want to give you a chance to comment on this, because Tim's position here seems to be like Medicare for all, but only for emergency care, not preventive.
Right, as in, like, what we already have. That's called EMTALA. That's been the law of the land since the 1980s, and you can't deny someone emergent care. Whether medical emergencies, obstetric emergencies, you cannot deny. So we kind of already all have that. But yeah, the flaw with this argument, I guess, when what he would call universal health care is the sort of the safety net of being able to get medical care when you have an emergency, so people aren't dying in the streets, and that's all well and good. But if that's all you're doing, and then when it comes time for maintenance and health prevention, disease prevention, primary care, sort of follow-up secondary care for management of chronic illnesses, and that's not covered, you're going to have such an overwhelming amount of people with medical emergencies, and the declining in I guess the decompensation of chronic conditions, where that's a top-heavy medical system that's going to cost more money. Like, an ounce of prevention is worth 1,000 pounds of treatment. So if you're not going to cover someone's ability to see their doctor every few months, to have their blood pressure medicines refilled, have everything checked out, labs done, all the routine health maintenance, and people can't get that done if they can't afford it out of pocket. But you let that guy walk around for a decade with uncontrolled blood pressure, cholesterol, sugar, whatever else, and he ends up needing a quadruple bypass and to go on dialysis, and then that's covered. That's quite literally the most expensive, least cost-effective, and unfeasible way you can run a medical system. And effectively, it's what we already have. So I'm not really sure where he was going with that.
Yeah, I suppose it's possible that he just means that, like, I guess the difference between what we already have and what he's floating is that, like, you'd be that you wouldn't get the bill when you got back from the hospital for your emergency.
Okay.
I mean, that's charitable. Right. I think he's being really unclear about what he means. But even if that is what he means, which would be an improvement of the status quo, like, it's also, I think, crazy for exactly the reason you just said, right? It's like, well, hold on. Like, if you, people who can't afford, because people don't, like, just in the normal course of life, people don't go to the doctor to get stuff checked out all the time because, maybe they don't have insurance. Maybe they do have insurance and they don't, but, like, it's still,
they have a copay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's like you have something that, like, could be cancer and could be nothing, that, like, you just hope it's nothing and keep plugging. And it's like, yeah, that just seems like if you're like just having the state cover a bunch of emergency medicine, but not preventative medicine, that's, like, even just, like, in totally take the morality out of it, just in terms of, like, cost efficient use of resources, like that, like, that's crazy just on those grounds.
Yeah. And of course, like, bringing in the social determinants of health, because that actually ends up having a much larger impact on health outcomes than health policy does. And so bringing around, I think at some point, I don't remember if she already did it as far as where we were watching, but I think at some point she starts talking about things like universal housing and other sort of socially driven programs to help people from ending up in desperate situations, and asking him his position on that. I think that was another good sort of rhetorical tactic to kind of challenge his viewpoint. I'm curious what you think about the debate about crime. I think if I'm calling balls and strikes, I think that discussion was a little bit of a wash, because violent crime, I would probably contend a little bit that violent crime is necessarily correlated directly with poverty, as opposed to crime of either like property crimes, theft, crimes of disorder, and things like that. I think certainly you make a strong evidentiary argument based on what we've seen historically that those things are tied to poverty, but I'm not sure that you could make a clear-cut argument that violent crime correlates with poverty. As far as what I've read, I'm not an expert in this area, but I also think that at some point the actual justice warrior guy tries to use the fact that crime dropped after the Great Depression as a way to like debunk the notion that poverty and crime are related, which I thought was pretty silly, and it's been addressed pretty thoroughly in writing historically. So I think this is a good example where you have one person debating two people who are both sort of dropping pseudo facts and statistics, but she's doing a good job of bringing it back around to what she knows and to what's really relevant here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think on the crime discussion, so the actual justice warrior, Sean, who I should say, I've debated or been on panels, debating him a couple of times at different events, and including on this topic. And I think there's part of what he's saying that's plausible, like that, like I think is true, but I think the more important part I don't think is. So, like, in other words, okay, I do think that it's a mistake for the left to be sort of too quick to be dismissive of concerns about like spikes in crime and sort of say like, oh, that's all fear mongering, whatever. Like, I think like working class people are rationally worried about public safety. There's tons of polling, on that. I don't think that, I don't think we should adopt like the solutions of the right, on that. But I do think we should take the problem seriously. And I think one of the best points I ever saw about this was from an article a couple of years ago by Eric Levitz, New York Magazine, where he said, look, if, we thought it was a big deal on the left when like a lot of people at least temporarily lost their health insurance, during the economic disruptions because of COVID, we wouldn't say, well, okay, but whatever, it's not a big deal because, there's still fewer uninsured people than there were before Obamacare, right? Like that's, we have to make that argument, right? So I think it's a mistake to sort of say, well, increases in crime aren't that big a deal because, and I'm not necessarily saying this is what Emma meant or whatever, because, because it used to be much higher in the 90s. I think, I think that, I do think we should take the concern seriously. But I also just think crime does have a lot to do with poverty. And I think I get what you're saying, but I think maybe within violent crime, it's useful to make like a finer distinction. So like what kind of violent crimes are we talking about? Because obviously there are definitely kinds of interpersonal violence that have nothing to do with economics. I would never deny that. Like a lot of, like domestic abuse,
murders and
like crimes of passion, like that there are things like this that, that again, I don't think you could reduce to economics, and and I'm not very optimistic that these things would ever go away completely, even in a totally different and much better economic system. But I do think that the kinds of violent crime that like really drive like the crime rate, like gang violence, things like that, do seem to have everything to do with economics. I mean, just intuitively, like there seem to conspicuously be no cases of kids who grew up in like affluent families in the suburbs and joined street gangs. That doesn't seem to happen, and
Right.
it does seem like maybe non-coincidentally, Nordic countries that have really powerful labor unions and really strong welfare states, and have they're still capitalist countries, but have achieved like a much higher level of certain kinds of economic equality than we do, like, have much more lenient and humane criminal justice systems, but still less crime, right? Like still a lot less crime. And like, I mean, the sort of standard joke we always used to make about this on the show, we bring up this point is like, come on, like if you think that this is just that their like culture is innately nicer, watch that movie from last year, The Northman, right? That's
right. Yeah.
I think that there are. I don't think the culture is just innately nicer. I think that part is economics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think violent crime can sometimes overlap with like crimes of like breach of sort of public order. So when they're talking about people shoving people in subways, like that kind of is a crossover between sort of crimes of public disorder and violence, or like robbery, that can be sort of crimes of need or necessity, but also there can be a violent component to that. So there's a lot to parse out there, but I think the point is well taken in general that, I think there's a pretty well established history that there are causal links between poverty and maybe even more importantly, economic inequality and disparities in economic well-being and crimes, because you have haves and have-nots, and those sorts of crimes of opportunity when you have people that have remarkably little and are in sort of situations of desperation, and there's other, markedly affluent individuals, and you have these increasingly exaggerated situations of wealth inequality. I think that's another really important driver, more so than like poverty itself. If you have a impoverished nation but without a ton of inequality, as opposed to a very wealthy nation with a ton of inequality, I think that's another important distinguishing factor.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important, that it's not, like if everybody is poor, then I think you're going to get less economically driven crime than if you have, poverty like alongside affluence. So yeah, okay. At the end of where we watched, I think Emma had. Well, actually, last thing I want to say before we go back to it is just like, I also do really like the point about, that's just bringing up. This is bringing up mental health here, right? Because in a lot of cases, and to your larger like meta point earlier about how to do these things, I mean, Tim is like throwing out this claim about subway murders that it's like, where is he getting this? Like he's saying these are all homeless people, but like, is that just his assumption that he's pulling out of thin?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. Right. But like, I do tend to agree with her that what that sounds like is, it's not, we're not talking about like economically driven crime in the sense we've been talking about, but I think that if somebody is like, pushing a random person in front of the train, then like it sounds to me, right, like my first guess would be that there's that there are like unaddressed psychiatric issues going on there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. I mean, either it was a mafia hit or
exactly.
Right, or I mean, clearly that's most likely not someone in their right mind. I think when you have this discussion, there are important caveats that you want to be very cautious with, and not propagate stereotypes that mental illness is associated with violence. The vast majority of people who are mentally ill are not violent, and you know that. I know you know that, and I know Emma knows that, and I don't think she meant in any way to imply otherwise. I think it's just an important caveat you've got to make sure to kind of bring into the conversation that while yes, you can attribute these sorts of violent acts to decompensated states of thought disorder or other sort of mental health crises, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should attribute mental illness with violence towards others, because in the vast majority of cases that's not the case, and in fact they're more likely to actually be victims of this kind of thing. But you know that. I don't have to tell you that, but I think it's an important distinction that I think has to get made in this context.
Yeah, I mean, there are kinds of violence that are caused by kinds of mental illness, but that doesn't mean that like most mental illness is going to No, that's all right. So last thing before we cut off is she'd started to pivot to housing. So let's pick it up there.
He's on your program. Like in Houston, what they did, there was a pilot program under Obama. It was a HUD grant. And they reduced homelessness by 63% over 10 years because they guaranteed housing. Do you think that the 25 examples that you cite last year, and there's like over 2 million subway riders a day. So you cherry picking that, I feel like is...
It's not cherry picking. It's you asked, or you mentioned that desperation leads to crime.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering why it is specifically that we saw this increase. Is it like someone's desperate, but why murder somebody? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, they're experiencing a mental health episode. We do not have adequate health care in this country, mental health care. I hear a lot of talk often after mass shootings that mental health is the most important thing in this country. Then we should have socialized healthcare so everyone can have access to it. And that paired with a housing first policy where cities don't become urban centers for just bridge and tunnelers who want to come in and see a show, or for restaurant associations, where places where people can actually live and there's guaranteed housing for people. If we were able to do that, we would be able to drastically reduce the crime that you guys are talking about here.
So when you're talking about poverty leading to crime, like what is that based on? Because after Prohibition was repealed,
all of human history,
during the Great Depression, crime fell. During the Great Recession, people with your line of thinking thought we would see a crime spike nationwide. It didn't happen. You can actually look at the crime wave if you wanted to pull it up. That didn't occur. And that was the largest recession in the history of this country since the Great Depression. So what we've seen throughout American history is poverty not leading to crime. What we actually see is the opposite, that crime drives areas into poverty. We look at store closures across the country due to the fact that we have shoplifting. That leads to decaying in the neighborhoods. When people abandon the neighborhoods and you see this blight, that has a psychological impact on people, and that drives people to commit these crimes.
I mean, you're working backwards from the...
No, you're actually working backwards.
Wait, but no. Poverty, clearly, this is a very simple concept, leads to something like shoplifting. Why would someone shoplift based on a personal pathology? They're shoplifting because they're desperate.
Not necessarily. So we have a lot of lax shoplifting laws in California, for example.
So
and what they find is we have a lot of organized retail theft because there's no consequences for it.
It's profit.
For instance,
people are trying to make money.
Well,
they're desperate, and we have untold levels of income inequality in this country.
Well, is it income inequality or poverty?
Since the late 70s, 900%. That's the increase in CEO pay versus 12%.
Mm-hmm.
I know we stopped just really recently, but like the thing that drives me crazy about Sean's position here is, okay, I really want to know, like, given that Sean's explanation of shoplifting seems like it would apply equally well everywhere, right? So why is it that you just have stores closing in certain places because of shoplifting? Like, why isn't the shoplifting just evenly distributed, throughout the entire country, like every kind of neighborhood? Like, I don't really see how you would explain that.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. And then the other thing, I don't know how accurate and reliable he thinks crime statistics were in the 1930s, but I would be a little cautious with the interpretation therein. Also, of course, after Prohibition gets repealed, you're going to see crime fall. Duh. You've taken a major illegal activity and legalized it. And there are so many dynamics between a depression, or a huge recession, a depression, and a depression recovery that would impact crime, where those are different. That's sort of a different set of circumstances and driving factors, and then to try to apply that to just debunk the notion that poverty is related to crime. I mean, this is something that's been written about. I think that's a little silly. If you wanted to use a slightly more contemporary example, you could talk about like 1950s into the 1960s with steady periods of prolonged economic growth, expansion, improvement, building of social programs, where you had decreases in crime. And then I think the following decade, 60s going into the 70s, you had a continuation of that expansion, and yet crime started going way up. and so there's not that sort of continued trend there. He'd be making a drastically better point if you use that as an example. But even there, I think there's some sort of counter examples that you can make that don't necessarily debunk the notion that poverty and crime are causally linked. I mean, it's a complicated discussion, but I think he's way oversimplifying it. He's doing it on purpose because he knows that these counter arguments exist, and he's not engaging with them because he's kind of counting on people in Tim's audience not to know this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going on in Sean's mind. It's possible that he totally believes everything he's saying, but like, if so, I don't think he's thought about it enough because I don't think that I don't think that makes sense, and I also just think I think the point about prohibition is perfect because it's like, well, okay, you have a lot more you have a lot more economic desperation, but also like you just cut the legs out from under like probably the most important economic basis of organized crime, in the past decade before that happened. And also, not for nothing, like, this is an era where pretty quickly, it's, prohibition doesn't actually get repealed. I'm trying to think about the timeline here. I believe, right? I mean, that happens like right around the time FDR comes in office, like a little bit after, right? So this is also, it's not like the economic misery is just static at the same time as this. I mean, they famously, right? I mean, the Roosevelt administration actually did like swing into action pretty quickly on taking office to try to to mitigate the severity of the crisis, and eventually did lots of things that are like almost unimaginable now in terms of like mass public works programs to employ people, which is like probably one of the most effective things you can do to combat, economically caused, crime that actually give people jobs, so it just seems like that one. I mean, maybe the example about the Great Recession in the late 2000s is better, but I mean, like the Depression prohibition thing. I mean, it really just seems just painfully obvious that there are like all these other explanations for like why that would be a time when you'd get a lot more crime.
Yeah, exactly.
Even assuming that the stats are immaculate. I also take your point there. I mean, I was think of that old like John Mulaney bit where he's talking about watching cold case files, and it's like, man, how easy was it to get away with murder? It's like and he does this little bit. It's like, detective, there's a pool of blood on the floor. Oh, gross, clean it up. I wouldn't necessarily assume assume that the stats are great, but even if they were, I think there are a lot of other explanations to that one. All right, let's keep going.
% for the working class in this country.
You
don't think that leads to levels of desperation?
So wait, is income inequality the cause, or is poverty the cause? Because those are two different things.
I mean, they go hand in hand.
They really don't.
Yes, they do. Because all the wealth is going towards the CEOs and to the billionaires in this country.
But it's not a zero-sum economy.
Down.
But what does it mean?
But also, if income inequality is the driver of crime, then how come we saw a giant crime decline after the mid-90s when income inequality was going up? In fact, we saw this happen all the way to 2019.
Can you repeat that?
We had a giant crime decline from around 1995, 1996 nationwide, from all the way to 2019, while income inequality was rising during that period of time.
Right.
So why would that occur if income inequality is driving crime?
I mean, I'm not exactly sure, you're the expert, but I do know that you're saying that there was an increase in crime in 2021 and 2022, and it doesn't matter now that it's going back down to 2023 levels.
This is just New York City.
I can't see this. Yeah.
I just pulled up New York City.
Look at that. Right. Exactly.
So at the start of 1990, crime was at its highest, and it dropped rather massively into just before 2000, where it continued to decline. And then from 2019 into 2020, we see a huge increase. That's pre-pandemic. Right. So there's a couple interesting things to point out there.
No, to be clear, that's not pre-pandemic. That's the year-over-year increase. So it would be in the year 2020. To be clear, so 2019 would be the low number.
The increase actually, the draw is before 2020. Meaning that could be 2018 to 19. Then, if that's the point you're making.
No, it's I've seen these numbers. I'm telling you, you're reading this chart wrong, because in New York City, do they have the raw number of homicides on the side? If you track it, you have around.
Yeah, this is just
murders right here.
Right.
Guys, you have about 300, and then it jumps to about 469.
Oh, yeah. I mean, crime dropped everywhere throughout the country since lead gasoline was outlawed. There is a massive connection, lead paint, lead gasoline predominantly affecting poor and lower income people, which probably did contribute to some of the increase in volatility in that kind of instance.
I completely agree. I read that report. It was fascinating that when we started taking lead out of the atmosphere, crime started to drop. But that would also make the argument that it's not poverty driving crime. It was like chemical imbalance or something.
It's both. It's absolutely both.
Well, I think it would play a role. Like the lead would play a role because it was in gasoline, so it was in the air. Yeah, so it's impacting everyone.
It depresses brain function and things like that.
True. Yeah. But I think public policy has a huge impact as well, because again, we saw a dramatic crime. This crime wave started in the 1960s, right? And this is when we started embracing this idea that poverty was the root cause of crime, that this was more the realm of the social workers, all things that sound really familiar to today. And from 1960 all the way to 1979, the incarceration rate, even though in raw numbers it was rising, was dropping per capita. So we saw this crime increase, and what you would end up getting in 1979 for murder on average was something like 5 years. For rape, it was something like 3.4 years. And obviously, like, this created a problem because we just weren't prosecuting people. This is why we ended up going with a mass incarceration solution, which, by the way, did work, and all these other policies to get tough on crime. You laugh, but you're definitely
No, I mean,
wrong.
mass incarceration, we incarcerate more people than any other country.
We have the highest rate of violent crime for any modern Western country.
I mean, I don't have that statistic in front of me, but we still... So how does that connect to the mass incarceration point? If it worked, then what does the violent crime rate have to do with it? You just want to warehouse more people?
No, I didn't say when I say it worked, we started expanding the prison population seriously in the 1980s to the 1990s. If you go to the Brennan Center for Criminal Justice, which is a left-wing organization, they say post the year 2000, mass incarceration lost its effectiveness. But most of the mass incarceration was pre the year 2000. So obviously it had some impact, and it ranges. Low estimates are about 6% on the crime rate, which is very low, but the high estimates are about 30%. And the reason it worked is because the philosophy behind mass incarceration is pretty simple. What you're trying to do is incapacitate criminals, because the same criminals are often reoffending. You brought up shoplifting earlier. You can actually pull up an article to find out that the same 300 people in New York City represent a third of the shoplifting arrests total for a single year.
Probably because they're incredibly impoverished and they need to find a way to actually sustain their livelihoods in this country.
That's put a very good way. That's phrased very well, to maintain their livelihoods.
Well, so, no, I mean, no, their life is a better way to maintain.
Sure. But like, I guess my point is, some of them certainly are desperate. But when you see videos of a guy like shoveling stuff into a garbage bag, that's not desperation.
But again, this is what you do, Tim. You return to anecdotal examples when I'm trying to talk about.
We're talking about just the 300 people.
And I am talking
which is the anecdotal evidence.
What 300 people?
He said the same 300 people, the ones committing the crime. I said, right.
A third of the shoplifting arrests in New York City.
These specific individuals are doing it for profit.
Okay, so we should have a system of mass incarceration, because there are 300.
I didn't say that.
Because I'm talking to you now. There are 300 repeat offenders.
No, we should incapacitate repeat offenders so they stop offending.
Got it.
So
you're arrested, all about the fact that you're not in favor
of
bail reform, because in New York State, which is now currently being rolled back, we decided that we weren't going to require cash bail for nonviolent felonies and for misdemeanors. And you think that that's a good policy?
To not require cash bail?
Yeah.
No,
I think that we're rolling it back.
I think look, if you're concerned about people not being able to get out of jail because of their financial means, then I can understand reducing or even eliminating the cash bail system. Because I understand if you don't have a lot of money, even though you really only have to throw down 10% for bail in most cases, unless it's like a set figure for the bond, then I get that argument. But what you need, and the state of New York desperately needs this, is some kind of threat assessment. Like, you should be able to hold somebody if they present themselves as a danger or a repeat offender, regardless of bail, without bail, so that they don't continue to reoffend.
Okay, but do you know what happens when people are held in Rikers, for example, in a pre-detention center? How many deaths have happened there before they're even or convicted of a crime?
Look, there again, that's an issue for how the jailing system works in New York City, and I'm in favor of building out the jail capacity. Because
you're talking about cash bail, though. That is exactly the point that we're discussing here.
Yeah.
Right. So you're in favor of people being held before they're convicted of a crime.
Yes.
In Rikers.
If they show a propensity to reoffend, 100%.
What is a propensity to reoffend?
A history, like being arrested over and over again, prior convictions, yes.
So you think that they should be held in a prison that has been...
It's a jail, but yes.
Or jail, excuse me. A jail that has been proven to be one of the worst conditions in the country.
Well, it doesn't have to be specifically Rikers Island.
Dozens of deaths just this year, even if they haven't been convicted of a crime.
Convicted of a crime. Yeah, for sure.
But
that's very anti-constitutional and anti-democratic.
How is it anti-constitutional?
The Fourth Amendment. It violates the Fourth Amendment.
Protects you from illegal search and seizures.
Well, I mean, you are the right to a speedy trial. People are held. Fifth Amendment. Yes.
I do think we should have reform on the speedy trial side, but the idea that it's unconstitutional to hold somebody pre-trial is ridiculous. Our law is based on English common law.
Damn.
Yeah,
we're all bad.
Our law is based on English common law, and the reason we have jails is that you would actually be held in a dungeon awaiting trial. So it's like built into the system. Bail is like a courtesy. It's actually a progressive reform in response to that, where you lay down some kind of capital in place of.
Jesus.
I just had to pause at Sean saying that bail was a progressive reform because just as a fun piece of historical trivia, do you know who first instituted bail in England?
No, who?
Richard III.
Nice.
So yeah, that's if that's a progressive reform, we're really started the clock of progress pretty early.
Yeah. And of course, pilot programs to eliminate cash bail demonstrate that the overwhelming majority of people present for their proceedings without incident, and of course the sort of cash bail pre-trial confinement completely weaponizes the Justice Department against poverty. You put people, the prosecutors want to bump up their conviction numbers. So they'll basically say, okay, yeah, you can sit here in jail for 3 months waiting for your trial, or you can sign this guilty plea right now and go home today, and of course get back to your job and your kids. And of course, it was something like, was it like 90 or 95% of convictions, people never even see their day in court because they put people in these sort of high pressure situations that would be eliminated if you didn't have to come up with cash bail. So I don't understand how you would call that progressive.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess the part of his point I'm most sympathetic to is that there does need to be some kind of threat assessment that is more, is probably like has more levels to it than what New York has right now. That in other words, like I think there probably are cases that are short of like murder, right? Where where somebody isn't accused of murder, they're accused of lesser crimes, but it is also true that the crimes they committed involve some level of violence, and that they've been and that like maybe they've like some of the factors he's talking about actually would go into like a reasonable threat assessment there. I'm sympathetic to that, but and I don't know, and I'm not in making that point, I'm not saying that I have some like wonderful solution in my back pocket for exactly what that should look like. I think this is actually really hard. I think there's so many things wrong with our criminal justice system that just trying to pull one thread is really difficult. But I also think that his overall defense of cash bail is kind of incoherent, because on the one hand he wants to say, actually, it's not really a big concern that people are going to be sitting in jail because they can't afford it, because it's really not that much money. And on the other hand, he wants to say, well, it's really bad to get rid of cash bail because then like you're going to be releasing people in danger of reoffending back into the street, it's like, well, pick, right? Because if it's not, you know, if nobody's going to be sitting in jail because they can't afford it, then how does cash bail stop dangerous people from being put back on the street?
Right, exactly. You could be a very dangerous person with plenty of money, and you can meet your bail and be back on the street. That doesn't quite jive.
Yeah, right. I mean, like it's like the argument that cash bail is really important to keep dangerous people off the street only works on the assumption that these are people who won't be able to afford the cash bail. You know, like otherwise it just doesn't, you know, it doesn't compute, right? So it's like, I mean, I think that the more honest argument would be if he just said like, yeah, I'm going to assume that most of these people can't afford it, and that's a good thing and whatever. But then I think the reason he doesn't want to say that, and like very few people in his position really want to say that, is that it sounds pretty gross when you say it out loud, that it's like, I want there to be people who, you know, exact same circumstances, but they had money in their bank account, would be out on the street, you know, but because they're still sitting in jail.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And you know, it may not be the case that the more money you have to put up, or the whatever collateral you have to put up, that's going to be sort of directly proportional to how carefully you're going to behave yourself and toe the line. No, because your bail may not be proportional to the severity of the crime that you either are going to commit or potentially have the propensity to commit. And then, you know, there's the question, the two things that come up would be, are you going to reoffend? But then are you going to skip, right? Are you going to take off? In which case you're forfeiting whatever money you put up. And again, I think that what the research has shown is that the vast majority of people don't end up skipping out. And of course, if you reoffend, you basically jeopardize your chances of being able to get out on bail again. And of course, then you got charges stacked on. So there's kind of already consequences for that. So that's already kind of built in. So I find it a little incoherent what he's kind of driving at there. And then of course the fact that there's a private company that's going to profit handsomely off of providing that bail, as opposed to it being some kind of like centrally or federally or state funded non-profit run organization. The fact that it's private individual companies with doing this service at a gigantic markup, shoveling cash in their pockets, is another issue that didn't really get touched upon here.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I don't know exactly what the right solution is, but like cash bail is like a pretty embarrassing anachronism as a way to do it. Also, the other thing I wanted to hit since the last time we paused was this idea that, I mean, I think Emma did address I think her point about lead was great. Although, you know, I mean, like, that's not just in gas, right? You know, that's lots of
paint.
Content. What's that?
Yeah, like paint and, you know, inside of buildings and pipes.
Yeah, exactly, right. And that was and there is like economic disparity in how quickly that was taken care of, obviously. But like, it's also just I think one of the really frustrating things about the way that Sean is arguing here, and by the way, like, look, nothing against Sean even, but like, why is he here for Emma and Tim? Like, shouldn't there be a fourth person that who agrees with Emma? But whatever. Like,
right? Yeah,
that's a little weird. But
yeah, I agree.
But like, in you know, the way a lot of the arguments that Sean is making here, the frustrating thing about them is that there's this, I think, very quick. I think there's this very quick blurring together of, I think, the just pretty obvious claim that, you know, economic inequality in the specific form of poverty, right, alongside of affluence, is like a huge driver of crime, and the one that's like it's possible to do most about through public policy, and, you know, and sort of the thing that reasonable solutions should most focus on, which, you know, I would certainly defend. And I think he's like really quick to equate that with, this is the only possible factor that could affect the crime rate, which like
Right.
nobody says.
No, exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, who says that that's the only thing that affects the crime rate? It's like, yeah, I'm sure the lead thing has a lot to do with it. And also, of course, yeah, that's going to have economically disparate impacts too, because even if everybody has the same level of lead exposure and like you have, it's still the case that like people who have trouble like getting it together to like, you know, go to jobs and stuff like that, depending on their family backgrounds, like that's going to play out really differently. But
Right.
but also but also like, yeah, like I'm sure 100 things, like it's not that like that's the only thing that's relevant that happened, that the only things that are relevant that happened in the 90s are increasing economic inequality and increased incarceration. I mean, those are certainly two big important things that happened then. But I mean, also even just like the proliferation of cameras to like be more likely to catch people in the act. I mean, that's like a big thing that happened in the 90s. That's you know, like it just seems like a lot of this is and yeah, that really, and I also think Emma does like hit the most important point, which is, okay, if your response to we have the highest, you know, incarceration rate in the world, more or less, I think there's like some island nation that like sometimes beats us some years, whatever, but like pretty much the highest incarceration rate in the world. And if your defense of that is going to be, oh, we have the most crime, then it's like, well, then the solution isn't really working that well, right? Like if we,
yeah, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, the other thing that proliferated during that time was the corporate level build out of prison, like Correction Corporation and Whack and Hut and Geo Group and these massive like publicly traded companies that build out prisons and detention centers, which, you know, are giving political contributions and interacting in that manner with law enforcement. And you're basically getting these public-private partnerships to build out these new state-of-the-art facilities. Now you're putting pressure on like prosecutors to start filling these things up because they generate revenue. And so now you're actually relying on the prosecutors or like local lawmakers and national lawmakers start passing more laws, criminalizing things, giving more of an incentives to enforce laws. Of course, there's laws, and then there's a selective enforcement and criminalization in certain types of neighborhoods and areas and others. But there's like pressure exerted on filling these prisons up because it's generating like Wall Street money. There's like publicly traded companies and stocks trading that are depending on basically filling up these jail cells. So that's, of course, that profit motive is always going to play a role in these sorts of incarceration rates and crimes and conviction rates.
Totally. Like it's not, and I know some people will get that twisted, you know, because there is like an argument in the neighborhood of that I think doesn't really check out, that it's like people think that, I think people often think that prison labor sort of plays a bigger role in prisons and in the economy than it really does. You know, if you could look at the Prison Policy Institute and stuff, like it's not really the case that, you know, we're talking about like factories behind bars, whatever, but that's totally separate from what you're talking about, which is just like, if you have, you know, contractors whose like contracts with the state depend on how many cells they can fill up, then there's this, you know, obvious bad incentive, and it's you have this grotesque you know, and it's like particularly grotesque when those same companies can donate and lobby you know, politicians to you know, to have harsher, you know, it's you know, penalties. So it's like it's the domestic equivalent of on Monday, people might have seen it, Bernie Sanders had an op-ed in the Guardian about why he was voting against the Pentagon budget, the National Defense Authorization Act, and in there, I mean, one of the things he points out is that like how much of this money goes to private military contractors, and then the sort of particularly grotesque thing that those private military contractors themselves turn around and give some of it back to the same politicians who are voting for these increasingly over the top military budgets. So yeah, I think you do have a domestic equivalent of that. But let's keep going.
Of yourself.
How much money do you want to spend on jails in New York City?
As much as it takes.
So just warehousing people before they're convicted of anything.
Well, again, it's not warehousing everybody, but if you have a propensity to reoffend, I think judges should be able to have judgment. It's kind of in the name, and assess these people and hold them.
So you just want to give it to the judgment of the judges, and it doesn't.
Yes, I would like the judges to have judgment. Yes.
Okay, but there should be guardrails in place to prevent judges from. I mean, judges are human beings; they can be unjust as well. I don't really put. Them
Well,
on the pedestal that you do.
Obviously, I'm not in favor of like $1 million bond for somebody who's arrested for shoplifting, even if they're arrested 27 times. So yeah, you can have guardrails from the legislature, but they can't assess dangerousness right now in the state of New York.
They assess it in ways. The reason we put this law into place, which is now being rolled back, that were deemed inherently racist. They deem that it was disproportionately black and brown people who are warehouse.
Okay, but how's that racist though?
Because at their discretion, it was implemented in a racist way. It's
but
the
if you
same
look
way
at the
that
crime
stop and frisk.
statistics, they're
well, there you go. So
disproportionately black and Hispanic.
So this is what the reality is for you: is you believe that black and Hispanic people inherently are committing.
When did I say
more
inherently?
Crimes. I mean,
if you pull up like NYPD crime data, for instance, since you brought up stop and frisk, you can look at the shootings, like the shooting suspects in any given year. And if you find me a year where 92% or greater is not black or Hispanic in terms of the shooting suspects, then I mean, I would be shocked because I've looked at it for the past 20 years.
So
yes,
that's the cop's discretion. So
no, it's you get a report,
right,
and you get a description of the suspect, and they are 92% every single year or above black or Hispanic.
Can I tell you guys a very famous New York story? There was a black cop, and he went to Central Park and started giving out tickets to white couples having picnics and drinking wine. And he said public alcohol consumption is a crime in the city, and he started giving these uppity yuppies tickets.
Right.
He got in serious trouble. The reason he did it was because the cops would go into the black neighborhoods and give people drinking 40s on their stoops tickets. And he said, how can these people at their own homes, on their own porches, get a ticket for drinking booze? Then when I go into Central Park and say, we're going to apply the same standard, I get in trouble for it. So New York's got serious problems. Even Bloomberg, like that guy's awful. He made a bunch of like, I'm not going to say that.
But the reason I just want to cut you off because you mentioned Bloomberg, and I want to respond to what you said. Under Bloomberg, 90% of the stop and frisks that were done were, by the way, they didn't find anything, but 90% targeted black and brown people. So you're taking.
So the highest number, by the way, is 86%, not 90%. But go ahead.
You're taking the data and using what the cops did, where they over-police in certain areas, and then pretending like there's an overrepresentation inherently criminally in those kinds of populations, and it's
okay.
A racist argument.
So you're wrong in a bunch of different ways. So let me just like run through them. So first and foremost, the highest year was 86%. And that was the year with the dramatic increase in stops. And if you ask me if I'm in favor of just expanding stop and frisk, which is different from Giuliani's stop, question, and frisk, although, you know, you might not be interested in that specific difference, to the levels that Bloomberg did, I would say it's unnecessary. It aggravates people. It creates a whole bunch of problems. That being said, they're not over-targeted because, again, there is no year during the entire tenure of Bloomberg where the shooting suspects were any less than 92%. So what the NYPD does, because it's the most data-driven police force in the entire world, is they map crime through a system called CompStat. When there's a lot of shootings in a specific area, they send the police to those areas. The stops, questions, and frisks all relate to where the shootings are, and it just so happens to be those areas are black or Hispanic.
Right, but do you get accosted on the street by cops regularly in New York City?
It happened to me when I was younger, yes, but like not
okay.
now.
But do you understand?
But to your point about hit rate, because you brought it up, hit rate was not the goal of stop, question, and frisk. Like this is one of the things where you're like, oh, well, this program didn't work because my standard that I look for arbitrarily shows that it was ineffective. That's like saying a plane doesn't work because it's not a good submarine.
No, it's
like
not
that doesn't
arbitrary.
make any sense.
90% of the stop and frisk came up with nothing.
True, but the point was to deter the carrying of firearms.
Have you done illegal drugs in your life?
Maybe.
I have. I could have been stopped and frisked, and I could have gone to prison, or I could have been held if I had a little bit less money in Rikers indefinitely until my trial came. Because a cop just decided, hey, I'm going to stop and frisk you, but they wouldn't do that to me because I'm a white woman.
That's nice. But anyway, it's about shootings. And the point of the program, and this is stated quite literally, to deter people from carrying illegal firearms.
And absolutely not.
It 100%.
Wait, are you in favor of gun control?
And so this is what I'm trying to say.
I'm a New Yorker, so I'm not like a big gun guy, but
let me. This is my point.
Target guns, and that's why.
Yeah, you definitely got to target.
I'm going to agree with Emma, but Emma's not going to agree with me. The idea that the police can decide to arbitrarily stop people because they might be carrying a firearm violates the Second and Fourth Amendments. Well, again, stop and frisk is completely unconstitutional.
That's why Fourth Amendment was in my mind.
Well, again, it's you're supposed to stop, question, and frisk, and usually it's based on reasonable suspicion. And they're supposed to
I'm bearing arms.
They're supposed to. They're supposed to follow the Terry standard.
This idea that because a particular group of people may be carrying guns, we're going to go start stopping a whole bunch of them. I'm like, the Constitution protects our right to keep and bear arms in the first place. So now you're violating, you're ignoring the Second Amendment and using that and by ignoring it, now you're violating the Fourth Amendment. I mean, it's absolutely nonsense.
This is why I'm actually critical of Bloomberg's expansion of the program, because the way it used to work is that if you had a shooting suspect, you would have a description, you'd send cops to the area, and they would stop people with that description, ask them questions, and if there was reasonable suspicion, they would conduct a search. This is why under Giuliani, the maximum amount of stops in a year, and New York City of 8.5 million people, was 90,000 people. And under Bloomberg, it was something like 700,000, maybe 800,000 people. So he dramatically expanded the program to the point where I do think it was constitutionally violative.
So you are kind of to the right of Donald Trump on this, who has been releasing nonviolent offenders.
Donald Trump's First Step Act is absolutely terrible. It sets up a bunch of incentives.
Well, I mean, you're further right than I'd imagine a ton of this audience is. I mean, that's fine. That's like
I'm not here to win over the audience. Well, I will win over the audience because I'm correct, but
audience is mostly moderates.
But Donald Trump's First Step Act had a lot of language about going soft on youthful offenders, and that's one of the reasons why a huge portion of the increase in homicide that we're seeing is among young men, and specifically among young Black men in this country.
I want to bring your guys' attention to this chart because there's a lot that it shows. I know it's just murders,
right?
But we're talking about, you mentioned something about the 60s. For some reason, in 1962 to 64, we start seeing, from 1962 onward, a ridiculous spike in the murder rate, offenses per 100,000 population. I don't know exactly why. We can see around 1990, it starts to decline rapidly. There's a couple interesting points there. This is U.S. murder rate. So New York City's broken window policing has nothing to do with it. This is the entirety of the country. Mm-hmm. This could be one of two things. When the leaded gasoline, that was the 80s, right?
I believe so, yeah.
We were getting rid of it.
And the last truck, I think for trucks, it was the 90s.
But this also coincides with one of the, if not the largest economic expansion, or I shouldn't say that now because who knows how you define it with the pandemic and all that stuff. But we had a massive economic boom in the 90s. So this would interestingly correlate with the idea that as people started to get more things, like their lives started to improve, crime, murder rates started to drop dramatically.
Yeah, and I would say that that was a temporary kind of sugar high based on neoliberal policies of Reagan and Clinton, where there was a lot of money that was released back into the public because of massive tax cuts. I mean, we can talk about confiscatory taxation if you'd like, and the top marginal tax rate. The top marginal tax rate in 1961. It's funny that you brought up that figure. 1960, it's 91% compared to 37% now. But like
it went down in the 60s.
Reagan cut a bunch of taxes during that time period, and a lot of people got an influx in cash.
Crime
and then
did drop.
Sorry.
Crime did drop.
Well, right, but that was temporary. Right. And then the income inequality kind of set in, and the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And that's mostly what I'm interested in talking about on my program.
Let me show you guys something which will add some context to the current crime spike. So you see right here, this drop off after looks like about 2007, there's a major drop off in murder, and then it spikes in 2014. The problem with a chart like this is that it doesn't account for technology. The reason the murder rate declined in 2007 was cell phones. So when cell phones became ubiquitous, the ability to call emergency services became instantaneous. So when people were victims of violent crime, you had emergency service notified immediately. And so this resulted in a drop in the murder rate, but not a drop in violent crimes, not a direct correlation, meaning crime had been going down, but the murder rate dropped more than violent crime in general because people weren't dying. They were being stabbed, they were being robbed, they were being shot, and they were living. That's not murder, so it wasn't counted as murder.
Well, there is a chart, by the way, that you can look at because that actually pairs recessions with this murder chart. And again, the correlation is not really there. And as far as New York, you say that it had nothing to do with broken windows policing. This is actually
that map specifically was the US.
So yeah, no, I know, but that's you said it had nothing to do with broken windows policing, but that assumes that there isn't a greater decrease in crime in New York than nationwide, which is not the case. There was a greater decrease in the city of New York. Like Chicago had a decline too, but Chicago's homicide rate, which is almost on par with the city of New York, is 6 times higher per capita than the city of New York. And in terms of raw numbers, it's double, even though they're at a third of the population, which is the same thing that I just said with different math. So New York became the safest big city, and our crime rate actually declined. And in fact, Freakonomics actually attributes this to the legalization of abortion, which happened in the city of New York pre Roe versus Wade. It was one of the 6 states that had it legal electively. So this is like a known thing that people have talked about and speculated on what the result is. Now, also for the environmental point.
Can I just...
Yeah, there's obviously a lot. There's obviously a lot going on in that chunk. That chunk we just watched. But before I go, do you have any thoughts about any of that?
I don't know. You go first.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like one thing that's a little bit, frustrating about this conversation to me, like, and I want to front load, I think Emma is doing exactly right here, which is that, she's, I think she's staying on message, and I think she's doing exactly what I want a leftist to do in a conversation like this, which is just sort of like relentlessly bring things back to like our kind of core issues about economic equality and, healthcare and et cetera, right? Like I think that is like maybe like the sort of top line thing that I'd look for in a conversation like this. And I think she's doing a great job of that. But I think like pulling back a little bit, one thing I find a little bit frustrating about this is that there's a lot of in the weeds back and forth here, and I understand why there is, but I don't know. I really want to like pull the camera back a little bit and sort of like do the bigger conversation about values, because like, let's say for the sake of argument that Sean is right about his last claim, not the abortion thing, from Freakonomics, but like the claim that, broken windows policing under Giuliani made the crime rate like drop a little bit faster in New York than it did everywhere else. Like, I don't know, maybe that's true. I have no idea. But let's say it was. Okay. So is that like, what follows from that for you, Sean? Right.
Right.
Let's say like, yeah, maybe that did, as you say, crime was dropping everywhere, not just New York, but let's say it was dropping a little bit faster in New York because of that. Okay. So like, do we want to live in a society where there's just like a lot more enforcement of like every petty crime all the time, and that's like the solution, right? Because it's like,
right.
Whether something makes the crime rate drop a little bit more than it would have dropped anyway is not really the only question that I think we need to ask here, right? So I think that it's, like, do we want, and I do also think that part of what Sean is getting some mileage out of here is that he was talking about these two concepts of poverty and economic inequality, and I think we should care about like both of them, but I also think we should care about them, like, we do need to make distinctions, right? So there's poverty, so you're talking about the like absolute standard of living of the people who are doing the worst, like where the floor is set. And right wingers love to play games with this. It's like, oh well, you're what we consider poverty in 2023 in America is still better than being a 12th century peasant and whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, sure, that's true, not really relevant, but yeah, I mean that like the floor is a floor where people aren't living the kinds of lives that people have a right to lead, and don't have the kind of dignity and ability to sort of ability to function in the way that they should be able to, and all of that stuff. That's one thing, obviously, that we should care about. Another thing we should care about is economic inequality for a lot of reasons, and I think that like one of them is one of them is just sort of intrinsic unfairness, that there's no reason that some people deserve to have like hundreds of times the standard of living of others. One of them is that it's, if you have extreme economic inequality, like the idea of equal citizenship kind of becomes a joke, right? That's like, oh, we're all going to have the same amount of influence politically, that like Jeff Bezos and somebody who works in one of Jeff Bezos's warehouses, are going to have the same experience if they pick up their phone to call their senator's office. So, and then, I think there are larger structural things about capitalism and whatever, but then I think if you're really specifically going to talk about crime, what matters the most isn't exactly just poverty, or isn't exactly just economic. And you said this earlier, and I think this is exactly right, that it's the intersection of the two. It's absolute poverty paired with affluence, like right next door to it, that like creates all these opportunities for crime that and so in the 90s economic inequality is rising, but it's not necessarily rising in a way that I would expect to lead to a lot of crime, because it's not that like unemployment was mostly rising. I mean, the sort of cliche about the 90s is that everybody had a job, but a lot of people had but it wasn't a General Motors, it was a McDonald's, and it was actually 3 jobs, and whatever. Like, that's objectionable for all kinds of reasons, but it's not like the kind of it's not exactly the situation that I would expect to generate a lot of crime in the same way as people just like not being employed at all. But like also, I guess like the big point I wanted to make about this is just that like, pulling the camera back a little bit, it's like, okay, crime is bad. We all want less crime. And let's say that like really repressive police state tactics, like having this psychotic, like level of mass incarceration that like no other country really has. Let's say that is, that like locking lots and lots more people up is actually effective. We actually know it's not that effective, because we still have this like crazy high rate crime rate. But like, let's say it's somewhat effective, that the broken windows policing under Giuliani actually did help crime drop faster in New York than it did in Chicago, or that or that like part of the differences in the crime rate of those different charts that Sean was busting out at different times is attributable to more like skull cracking kind of law and order policies. Okay. But that's not, but then the other question is that the only way to do it? Right. Are there other ways to do it? Do we actually want to live in a society where we have like lots and lots of poverty and inequality, but don't worry, there's still that generates a lot less crime than it would have because we like lock people up left and right? Or do we want the kind of society like Norway where they, right. The rates of incarceration are a tiny fraction, and like prisons are like, I don't know, dorm rooms at like state universities in the US, and people don't stay in there their entire lives, and nevertheless they still have a lower crime rate. Because I mean, I will, option B sounds a lot nicer to me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other one sounds kind of dystopian. And I think like he doesn't really seem privy to the notion of like proportional hazards, to use, I guess, like a medical analogy. If you were to suddenly see gigantic drops in smoking, but at the same time, maybe overall rises in high blood pressure and bad cholesterol, you might see drops in, say, heart attacks and strokes, that doesn't mean that high blood pressure and bad cholesterol aren't risk factors for heart attacks and strokes. It means there are proportional hazards that have differential levels of risk and causal attribution for a particular outcome. And sometimes you have to look at these things in a larger sense and more complex to be able to deter, oh, well, this went down, that went down, therefore this can't be that. It's not really how it works. Somebody in the chat earlier mentioned proximal versus distal causation. I thought that was a nice point too. I also want to touch on his, the thing where he was talking about how, well, show me a year when like 90% of the crimes that were called in weren't reported as like a black or Hispanic. Yeah. I mean, clearly the concept of bias is not something that this individual is too familiar with. And how reliable is it that, of course, you saw, again, another thing that was very well documented during this period of time was that through the steady level of decrease in violent crime, media coverage of violent crime was steadily increasing, and it was constantly being portrayed as black person, Hispanic person did this. And so you create a lot of cultural bias. So the fact that somebody's car got broken into, somebody heard gunshots and saw people, and that prompted the person to call in and say, a black person did this, as some sort of like irrefutable evidence that, yes, this was actually a black or Hispanic person that committed this crime is kind of laughable. And it's the notion where like, there's research showing that, a very high percentage of people who are bitten by dogs will report that it was like a pit bull or a Rottweiler. The reason this has not led like the American Veterinarians Association and ASPCA, et cetera, to endorse breed restrictions is because, as it turns out, people are very unreliable at actually being able to detect whether something was this type of dog. And it's just there's this notion that these are the dangerous dogs. So if there's a bite, they're more likely to say it was a pit bull or it was a Rottweiler. So during this period of time when there's this a lot of pervasive societal racism, constant media coverage, yeah, gunshots, this happened, window got broken, car got jacked. Yeah, more people are calling it in saying a black person did this. To point that as some sort of irrefutable evidence, and to even the extent that you can rely on that sort of bias-laden observation, it's happening in neighborhoods that are more impoverished, and you'd have to ignore the entire history of redlining and every other systemic issue that caused disproportionate sort of impoverished and lack of adequate resources in type of neighborhoods that were more minority predominant, as opposed to more affluent areas with better resources, better schools, et cetera, higher property taxes, fewer, less policing. So it's sort of taking the cause and effect and flipping it around. And he like clutched his pearls when Emma suggested that he was implying that this was inherent to like black or Hispanics, when that's exactly what he was doing.
Well, I mean, actually, there's a really interesting question there because, okay, I have no doubt, and I'm sure you're right that the like report statistics are not entirely reliable. A la the analogy about pit bulls and all that. Like, but I'm also sure that like even the real figures are still tilted. But
sure.
I don't. But as you say, there's like a really obvious explanation of that. That's
right.
But it's a really but this is why it's an interesting question how he gets off the hook of saying inherently, because that really obvious explanation doesn't really seem to be available to Sean, because he wants to deny that crime has anything to do with poverty. So the really obvious explanation is that it's like, yeah, you have more crime in predominantly black and Hispanic areas because predominantly black and Hispanic areas are disproportionately impoverished because of see all previous American history, right? That like the slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, et cetera, right? So if it's not that, right, then I would actually be really interested to hear what it is.
Right. Good point.
Like if it, because okay, like yeah, there's a sort of obvious explanation, like economic explanation of why these areas would be higher crime, but again, that would seem to undermine his whole point, up to this point. So it's like either he's got, so I mean, I assume he's not going to want to embrace like race science here, but that doesn't leave him with many options. I mean, you can sort of
he kind of backed himself into a corner. I think my favorite moment is when she pinned him down, like, "Oh, you're in favor of gun control, right?" Like that was just, that was beautiful.
Yeah, right. Because it's like, well, stop and frisk is justified because to get rid of all these, get rid of all these guns. It's like, okay, well, if the guns are the issue, then why don't you support gun control? And you can say, oh well, it's just that it's justified to clamp down on illegal guns. But it's like I'd actually love some. If anybody knows, I mean, if you know, whatever, like I'd love some stats on this. Like I'll bet an awful lot of gun crime is committed using legal guns.
Right. Yeah, I think, exactly.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah.
Just ask you a question about that.
Sure.
What does the connection to what does crime
That's what
have
Freakonomics says, that the legalization of abortion, and they compare it to Ceausescu, whatever country he was the dictator of. They say that correlates with crime because they say all these unwanted children end up being born and then they end up committing
Well, that
crime.
is certainly a claim. So that's how that works together then. You're saying that abortion should be illegal for that reason?
No. It would be legal abortion leads to less unwanted children being born. And again, you're
so
smiling,
are you in favor
but
of abortion?
I'm actually pro-choice, but not for this reason. But you're smiling. But the thing is, this is what was proposed in Freakonomics. I actually disagree with their analysis. They leave a lot of things out. But
So
again, I use that as an example to show that the New York decline did start before the national decline.
I'm almost positive that study has been called into question.
It is.
Just to clarify, you're saying more abortions meant lower crime? Is that what you're saying?
That's what Freakonomics asserted. It's in their little movie and it's in their original book.
I think that makes sense. If you've got two parents, you've got one parent, they got a baby, that baby's getting food. Like you could have no job, you could be homeless. Someone's going to find.
Well, you know what I would love to decrease desperation in terms of families in this country. I'm not sure if you've talked about it a ton on your program, Tim, but we should have made the child tax credit permanent that we expanded in the 2021 American Rescue Act.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So there was a tax credit that was in place, but during the pandemic, it was expanded to be a monthly payment. It also, the amount was increased, so it was up to $3,600 a month for 6 and under, $3,000 for 6 to 17, and then it also was expanded to include people who had too little income to qualify previously. We cut child poverty by nearly in half instantly, and the reason that we don't have it is because the entire Republican Party and Joe Manchin and Sinema essentially nixed it. But this is the kind of stuff that's possible in this country to make people less desperate. If you want less crime, make society a broader, more beneficial place for people with a bigger safety net so people don't have to turn to desperation.
Real quick, this is the crazy thing. So I think the only people who disagree with that are establishment Republicans, like the prominent Republican Party members.
You should talk about it more on your show.
I mean, I think that I'll go extreme with it. If after your second kid, no more taxes. Income tax, 0. Have 2 kids, no taxes.
I mean, I know that there have been certain proposals in places like Hungary that are like that, but they are heavily, heavily tilted towards heterosexual families as opposed to if a gay couple wants to adopt or have children. I don't agree with that because I want more taxation, frankly, so that we could have socialized healthcare. We could have a college for all act, which honestly you could pay for with a tax on Wall Street speculation. It would be incredibly easy. It's only $48 billion a year, which is less than the military budget increase that we did in 21 to 22, which was around $71 billion. I want to do that kind of stuff. And so getting rid of income tax, I would not be in favor of it. But if you want to create tax incentives for families so that they can raise their kids and they aren't in poverty, I am all for that, Tim.
But to your point about nobody would disagree, I would 100% disagree with that because, again,
you don't want tax credits for people that have babies?
There is not a demonstration that these policies that these work in reducing crime. In fact, we see the opposite. If you put up that homicide chart, it starts increasing during the war on poverty, which is the greatest increase in. Sorry, go ahead.
Not talking about crime.
She said if you wanted to deal with crime, this is how.
Well, I'm trying to connect it to this, but like,
right. But in the broader sense,
I think the most important thing to take away from this here is that every single Republican voted against the American Rescue Act and the expanded child tax credit. There is one party that is look, it's not
But
good enough.
saying,
I'm more obviously in the Bernie Sanders wing. I have
quick,
deep disagreements with Hillary Clinton-esque neoliberal politicians.
But
yeah, it's the Democratic Party in favor of policies that are going to be helping people on a day-to-day basis like this.
The Republicans voted against a broad bill that included one thing in it. Is that what happened?
Yeah, but they also fought tooth and nail about the actual child tax credit. This was a part of the Inflation Reduction Act negotiations as well. They were not in favor of that too. And Joe Manchin, your senator, right? We're here in West Virginia.
Awful. We hate him.
I mean, you gotta you're a celebrity here, right, Tim? In West Virginia, you should call on Joe Manchin and say, hey, why don't you do this? Why are you not in favor of the child tax credit?
That dude is neoliberal
totally
to perfection. It's like that nobody in West Virginia wants the guy.
Right. I mean, he's very unpopular.
That's not true. He's actually the most popular politician in West Virginia history.
Go talk to some people in West Virginia.
I'm sure you could find people.
Dude.
I get
what his numbers are in the tank.
I'm in right-wing nut job territory. Listen, this guy lost his mind.
I get why you're against him.
Maybe 4 years ago he was popular because the state, for whatever reason. But people are not happy with him today. I've not met a single person here who likes him.
I mean, they might be upset with him now, but
he's tanking in polling numbers and hypothetical matchups with Jim Justice in the Senate. That's actually a fact.
West Virginia, 86% Trump supporting state. Yeah. All of those people despise him for obvious reasons. But then you go and meet some of the more moderate, don't really care, middle of the road people, and they're just like, what happened to that guy? And so, look, man, I see what you're saying, but I'm telling you, like,
no, I get why you're against him. Because
it's not about me. I'm saying, like, we'll go hang out in any one of these. And this is the Panhandle. Don't get me wrong, but we were hanging out in Charleston, 5 hours from here. Not a single person I've ever met in West Virginia is like, I like that guy. Not one. I've talked to people who are like, who have told me in West Virginia that they don't like Trump. They would rather have DeSantis. And then they say, Manchin's got to go. He's got to go. We got to get somebody else. He's awful because he's like, he's not a Democrat or a Republican at this point. It's like he's a corporate. That's it. It's like he's of the corporate party. He doesn't seem to be catering to anybody.
He has a fine line to walk, in my opinion, to hold a state like this as a Democrat. And this, like, I get why she, being more progressive, doesn't like him, but he's like one of the only Democrats that could have won here, which is why when they tried running progressive in the primary, like that person got slaughtered by him. But I get why you would want to replace him. I want to replace him. The Republicans lost the Senate.
Jim Justice is very likely.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. I just want to point this out. Off the top of my head, I think Manchin's numbers are like 55% disapproval now.
I can't see him winning. I mean, look, I don't know for sure. I'm not psychic, but everyone I talk to, it's like you've got, I think it's, who is it, Mooney potentially, and Jim Justice. But Jim Justice seems very likely to get it. We'll see. I don't know for sure.
Well, you brought up Trump and DeSantis in West Virginia. I'm curious because I saw, Tim, you've been like upset a little bit about how DeSantis has been, or maybe not upset. Okay.
No.
Oh, you're pissed. All right. Yeah. So I'll characterize it as you're a little pissed at how DeSantis has been using those AI images of Trump
used
hugging
3 of them one time.
Yeah. What I mean, can you expand on that thought?
Ron DeSantis's team, in order to smear Donald Trump, ran fake images of him kissing and hugging Fauci alongside real images, and then wrote real life Trump over the top.
Right.
And it's one thing to play politics, which I despise. When you get someone being like, Nancy Pelosi voted against this act. And it's like the Saving Puppies Act, but it's actually a bill that like cuts taxes for oil companies, or the inverse where it's like, insert Republican voted for whatever. I despise all of that. But actually fabricating images, shrinking them down and placing them alongside real images and then writing real life Trump on it.
Can you pull up the image so I can see it?
Yeah. So, I mean, is that kind of the core of your, would you say as of now, if you were to vote today, you'd be voting for Trump?
Yeah.
But that's the core of your disagreement?
So, there's a lot more than that. Here, take a look at this. This is as I feel like this is campaign ending. I feel like this.
Really?
Yes.
I mean, it's funny to me.
The manufacture of fake images to trick people into voting for someone is, look, this is the open door. Ron DeSantis decided to be the person to stick his foot over the line and say, we will manufacture fake images to win.
I mean, they do say that they're fake. Like,
no.
But people
this is
would
someone
probably miss
They
this.
don't say it's fake.
No, it says right there. Fake.
This is an image calling out the fake graphics. They wrote real life Trump, and this is NPR circling the fake images to call them out.
Right.
They ran it as real life Trump. Now, I understand if you scrutinize the images, you can tell they're fake. This one says Mahehap Wems. Okay, yeah, that's not English, and it's under the White House emblem. But when it's in a video that's a minute long, and you pass this, I've already had people tell me that they didn't realize it was fake, and I've already people say I talked to my parents about it; they thought it was real. And so what the DeSantis fans are doing now is they're like, "Can you believe Tim actually thought those were real?" Like, dude, if you want to play that game and call me stupid and insult me for calling out DeSantis's campaign for doing this, I literally don't care. It changes nothing of my moral stance that this stepped well over the line. Now, I got to be honest. You go back in time to the first time a politician lied, and people were probably like, "Can you believe he actually lied to us?" And we know that's bad, and I hate all of it. But this is the next level. This is like, holy, it's bad enough they're all lying.
Well, what's the core of your disagreement otherwise then? I mean, if it's with
so we'll probably go to the post game for patrons, and we started about 10 minutes late, so for the main show, so we'll give it maybe another 10 minutes. But this seems like a good place to pause, because I mean, this is pretty funny to me that I'm not. Actually, I don't know. I've never talked to you about this, so I don't know what your feeling is about this sort of like, whether DeSantis would be worse than Trump or exactly the same or, whatever. But like, I mean, like Ron DeSantis, I think is in a lot of ways is a monster. But I also think it's like really funny that for somebody who it's like, oh, I don't like Ron DeSantis because he's being dishonest. Who's your guy? Oh, Donald Trump.
Right. Yeah, like Trump would be above doing something like that. Like that dude, like used a magic marker to make a hurricane look different. Like didn't do something like that. Like the idea that like, no, Trump would never stoop to the level of using a fake image. And the fact that he's hugging Fauci is just the most sacrilegious, awful thing you could have ever depicted him doing. He's hugging Tony Fauci. Ew. That's just really funny. But yeah, no, the Trump versus. I mean, I think I would have to do like a pro and con, sort of columns, because I think DeSantis would probably engage with other world leaders in a more diplomatic fashion. I think there's certain there would probably be a bit less of sort of an erratic nature to what he's doing. I think he's equally authoritarian. I think he would be more effective at implementing bad public policy, whereas I think Trump struggled as just as a crafty politician, like as a statesman, to be able to accomplish some of the terrible things he wanted to do. I think DeSantis would be more skilled at it, and we might end up just sort of materially with worse conditions. I don't think DeSantis is charismatic the way that Trump is. I don't think he's ever going to have that sort of cult following. So there's sort of less of that sort of frightening sort of cultish following behind Trump. I don't think you're ever going to see anything like that with DeSantis. So I would kind of have to weigh those out on balance. I think either one is horrific. Yeah,
I mean, I think that my feeling has for a long time been that if DeSantis were actually elected, I think if anything, he would actually be a little bit worse than Trump, just because of what you said a minute ago, which is that I don't think there's any area really in which his goals would be less bad than Trump, and I think that he's probably more competent, so he'd probably do a better job of carrying out those bad goals. I do see the point about like foreign policy might be less erratic, although even there, I'm sure it would be less erratic, but it's also like certainly in terms of like the anti-China hawkishness and stuff. I don't know that there's a lot of daylight there. I am actually curious. I'd totally forgotten about this thing they're talking about, or maybe I never knew it in the first place, with the Fauci images. Which is kind of funny actually. That's what would be really scandalous, right? Is that because I mean, I think that does go to a real thing with Trump and some of the Republican base, which is like a little bit weird, which is that there is a lot of, I mean, the DeSantis people are sort of doing their best to remind everybody of this, but like there's a lot of amnesia about Trump and COVID that, like, you know, look, Trump initially supported the shelter in place orders. He was certainly all about the vaccine. I mean, you know, Operation Speed, you know, all that. And, you know, and I think a lot of Trump supporters sort of retconned that away in their minds, you know, that they didn't want to remember those things about him, you know. So I guess that's what the fake images are really played off.
Right. He knows how to sidestep that, though. But the mandates are terrible. Don't like the mandates. Mandates are bad. And the audience starts applauding a little bit, and then he moves on. Like he can sidestep the vaccine stuff pretty easily, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be something that DeSantis is going to get a lot of mileage. I mean, look.
Yeah, I agree.
I've been wrong about shit like this before. I don't have a crystal ball, but like my very, very strong gut feeling is that this isn't really going to be much of a race. I think that Trump is going to eat this guy alive. Like,
yeah, I agree.
You know, this is what like really that's where Trump shone in 2016 was like mowing his way through a bunch of guys who were basically a lot like Ron DeSantis. So yeah, I think DeSantis would, if anything, be even worse if he were elected. But I also think that that DeSantis would probably be a weaker candidate than Trump.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people think the opposite. I might be wrong, but like I think you said this a minute ago. I think it's that like DeSantis just isn't charismatic at all, and like he doesn't.
Right. He's kind of a goofball.
Yeah, I mean, people in 2020 really did. I mean, like even though obviously more people came out for getting rid of Trump than for keeping him, like he still drove turnout to like a totally crazy level because he's polarizing, and the people who people who hate him really hate him, but like people who love him really love him. And I just don't see that with DeSantis. I mean, he's just kind of, I mean, he's like yeah. And again, I mean, like I think he's done like a lot of really despicable things. I mean, and
the Guantanamo Bay thing.
Yeah. And he was involved in torture in Guantanamo, and he's got and like, you know, because the big thing about DeSantis is that, and again, I don't think the strategy is going to work for him, but he's just relentlessly looking for ways to appeal to, basically like whatever right wingers are like most worked up about on Twitter that week. So whether it's like, you know, I don't know, kids at drag shows or, you know, whatever. And like, as part of that, after the 2020 election, he created this like state election task force thing that to basically election cops to crack down on, you know, I mean, the way it was pitched was like voter fraud, but when they actually started to go after people, it wasn't for fraud at all. It was for like, you know, people registering to vote when they shouldn't have been allowed to because they did, you know, they had unexpunged felonies.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, it like SWAT raids over that. I mean, it's like really, you know, really grotesque stuff. But anyway, before we go to the post game, let's hear what let's hear what Tim's critique of DeSantis is.
COVID, I would say I'm more on Trump's side with that kind of stuff. I liked Operation Warp Speed. Look, I would have done a little differently for giving away government money for vaccines. That we should have nationalized them, and the intellectual property should have been waived so that everybody could have had access to it. Also, in the
publicly funded should be publicly owned.
I'm in favor of that, Tim. So I mean, that's one thing that I think Trump is better. And look, just DeSantis is frankly an anti-LGBTQ demagogue, and that's where I think Trump's less dangerous than DeSantis. Okay,
like he is, but I think it's more so the Florida legislature that's doing it, and then he's latching onto it. Because I think when it comes to real issues related to this stuff, he's mum.
He's been anti-wokeness is the center of his campaign.
Yeah, he kind of made that at the forefront of his campaign.
No, for sure. I like DeSantis
Trump
in a
wouldn't
lot of
even
ways.
send the National Guard against the Black Lives Matter rioters.
That's a different question. That's not wokeness. That's like crime and law and stuff. DeSantis, I think, is mostly surface level. I like a lot of his policies. I think
What do you like about his policies?
I mean, at the beginning of COVID, it wasn't particularly good, right? He did a lot of what everyone else did. But to be fair, I was very much like, I guess, I was very much, Thomas Massey didn't want to do this big spending bill, and I said, this is crazy. The economy, like, we don't know what's going on. There are people dying. We're seeing videos of people dying in the street. And so I think, hindsight being 2020, I look back and I'm like, I probably should not have just gone along with all of that. That was probably stupid. Ron DeSantis did initially, but then changed and said, you know what, this is not making sense. We're reopening. And I think that made a lot more sense.
It was also under extreme pressure. Like Andrew Cuomo was the most promoted governor in the country, and he was the most attacked.
So DeSantis did well in not the first, but he did well in reopening things back up.
But what policies do you like generally about him? I mean, besides the COVID stuff, what are the other policies like as governor? I mean, you think it's just the state legislature that's putting together these anti? I think it's mostly Tim,
them.
You said that there was a grooming event happening at Club Q, and that was after the shooting, right? Which is essentially kind of saying, well, look, they had it coming a little bit. I mean, no, you didn't say that, but that's the implication.
I actually said, how do we prevent these things from happening? If people, so I tweeted.
So you actually seem pretty aligned with DeSantis on the the anti.
But I don't think it's him. I think it's the Florida legislature. And if DeSantis becomes president, you think Congress is going to vote for any of these things? As for the Club Q thing, I said, if people keep saying wood chippers, what did you think was going to happen? Right? I am saying, stop saying these things.
Saying what?
People keep going online and going wood chippers, wood chippers, wood chippers. You know what that means, right?
For who though?
For groomers.
Right. Okay.
And I'm like, what do you think is going to happen if you go online and keep calling for death? Like, don't do that. Stop that. Right. We want to stop child abuse. We want to stop violence. That's what we want.
So that's why I hope you have dedicated so much of your program to talking about the Catholic Church.
Nice. Not to engage in too much pedantry, but Pfizer turned down government money during Operation Warp Speed. I think you can make a broader argument that the sort of public academic research that was the precursor to the decades of mRNA research helped to give rise to the ability of BioNTech to come up with a certain technology and then partner up with Pfizer and yada yada. But Pfizer, in a distinguished manner from Moderna and some of the other companies, turned down that government money and they wanted sort of the government off their back, so that they would have been able to be a little bit more unbridled in how they approach the vaccine. So that's a little bit, just one little thing worth pointing out. But Moderna absolutely took Operation Warp Speed money, ran with it. They had never brought any pharmacological product of any kind to market before, and it became just a massive powerhouse. And they created the best vaccine, in my opinion, with the exception of males under the age of 30, who I generally recommend other vaccines for that population. Otherwise, they came up with the best vaccine. But Pfizer did not take government money per se, and they've been pretty ruthless with how they have engaged with lower middle income countries for distribution. And then J&J AstraZeneca, they actually had committed to not profiting off of vaccines until the pandemic was over, and basically selling things essentially at cost, working in some of the other operating costs out so that they wouldn't lose out on money. So really, I think the biggest recipient of this sort of criticism really should be targeted primarily at Moderna, as far as taking government money and then profiting off of it. Then also Pfizer, but for a different reason.
Yeah, so I'm looking at CNN has a fact check from a while back. Was Pfizer's work in coronavirus vaccine aided through Operation Warp Speed? And they go through some of what you just said, and their conclusion is the real story is more nuanced. Mm-hmm. Pfizer's vaccine progress is certainly not solely attributable to Trump's administration's Operation Warp Speed, right? Because they did decline they did decline like the research buddy. Although they also note that they had a major agreement to sell at least 100 million doses of the vaccine to the federal government.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think that the sort of broader point is definitely an important one, that a totally ridiculous percentage of, I mean, so yeah, I mean, certainly Moderna in the COVID case, and even in Pfizer, even in the case of Pfizer, it's a little bit complicated, but like more generally, the level of federal funding that makes its way to pharmacological research is like through the roof. I remember in Lee Phillips and Michelle Rosworski's book, People's Republic of Walmart, they have some figures on this, and like the number, like the percentage of like genuinely new drugs as opposed to like slight tweaks on existing ones that you can come out of like NIH labs and other kinds of like other things that have some level of government support is really, really high, which is also like, okay, Tim Pool, to be fair, doesn't like actually does seem to be a little bit better on this topic, but like but like a lot of these guys, I mean, that's like the kind of crazy thing about it, because they love to like accuse people who think that vaccines work and everybody should get vaccinated of being shills for the pharma industry. But it's like, okay, but like, do you guys actually want to do anything about this industry? I mean, I'm not hearing a lot of people who love this shills for the pharma industry talking about like, I don't know, nationalizing these companies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you talk to most people you would accuse of being shills for pharma industry, most of them would actually be in favor of a lot more nationalization, price controls against price gouging, etc. Also, you can look up anybody that's a doctor on openpaymentsdata.cms.gov, and you can look at exactly how much money they've taken from big pharma. And I would encourage anybody to look me up. And full disclosure, I took a little bit of money from Pfizer one year in order to do some non-product related education. I basically helped Pfizer communicate mechanisms of pain to doctors more effectively. It wasn't geared toward any particular drug or another, but they gave me like a couple grand. So just full disclosure. Other than that, maybe like, 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks a year, because someone came in and did a presentation on a talk, and I had a Subway sandwich, and they divvy up and they actually tally and they report it on you. So I've been accused of being a pharma shill before, and I just tell people, go look me up on Open Payments Data. Other than 1 year taking a little bit from Pfizer. Then again, I was a vocal advocate that I thought Moderna was the best vaccine, so Pfizer didn't really get much for their money from me. But
if next time I'm in New Jersey, I mean, I think last time I saw you in person, I think you picked up our bar tab. But if I pick it up next time, I might beat Pfizer as far as fair enough. Yeah, I also find it this argument that Tim is making here. I think it's a really weird argument, because he doesn't like DeSantis, but he doesn't. But I think he's in a weird position, because he actually does agree with a lot of the socially conservative DeSantis policies in Florida. So he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, by saying it's like, well, really, that's the Florida state legislature. And since Congress wouldn't pass the kinds of things that are passed in Florida, therefore DeSantis as president really wouldn't do anything to enact these policies, which is a really odd argument, because it's like, okay, well, so you don't think that the executive branch like exercises any power, or I don't know, like judicial appointments by the president, don't have any impact on social policy. Come on, man.
Yeah, exactly. And if he's going to do his little pseudo-populist thing where he hates corruption and all that stuff, it's probably worth noting that DeSantis took a ton of campaign money from the owner of Publix, which anybody who's familiar with Florida might be familiar with, a huge chain, Publix down there. And DeSantis gave them a pretty sweetheart setup as far as that particular chain being a recipient of like the first vaccine doses. Everything was at Publix. They were able to sort of get their hands on vaccines, and they benefited from that financially. And that was in a way, sort of at least indirectly a pay for play, because the owner of that was a big DeSantis supporter and donor. And so to say, oh, I just love what he did with COVID. Well, I don't think like he's an Occupy Wall Street OG, Tim Pool, and he hates all the corruption and all that stuff. I think he'd be maybe a little bit more critical of DeSantis for engaging in that. And then, of course, his public health department, like, directly and purposefully was caught pretty much red-handed with their pants down, directly and intentionally fabricating vaccine research to, like, make them look more dangerous than they were. And that was Ladapo, under who is DeSantis's basically like Surgeon General of Florida. And if you actually look at some of the outcomes comparative to the rest of the country, I don't know where he's getting the notion that DeSantis did a good job, quote unquote, like opening things up and whatnot. I think he was pretty both anti-scientific and a bit of a shill when it came down to like how vaccines were going to be allocated and which pharmacy chains were going to get them. I don't know how Tim would square that.
Yeah. You should send me if you send me a link to whatever you're talking about with the vaccine research. Because
we'll do.
You first started saying that, because I do remember something that did not pan out, where he was like accused of fabricating like the
Rebecca Jones thing.
Yeah. Like
no, not that.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing I want to say before we end the main show, go to the post game, is just before my own debate with Tim Pool last summer, whatever, it was like a panel. You were at it, right? Or like around immediately after. Like to sort of research that on the show, I watched some old Tim Pool clips, and I watched his debate with Emma's co-host Sam Cedar from 2019, I want to say, maybe early 2020, and it is just really funny to me the distance that he traveled between those two, because in that original one, in his long journey from Occupy Wall Street to whatever the fuck he is now, in that original debate with Sam, he was taking the position that, like, the lesser evil is still evil, and like if you're voting for either of the duopoly candidates, you might as well be pushing people in front of trolley tracks and all this shit. And just like now, now he's just like an outright Trump partisan.
Yeah, that's quite a character arc.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know that I'd watch. I was thinking about like the Breaking Bad character arc.
Yes.
I don't know that I would watch the Tim Pool show, but there might be potential there. It'd be like a thinly disguised version of the character. People would get it. He'd have the swords, he'd have the beanie, they'd call him something else. But
by the way, if the United States had universal health care, Walt White would never have become Heisenberg, because he would have been able to have all his cancer treatment covered, and he wouldn't have had to worry about going into medical debt.
Yeah. Be a very boring show in Canada.
Would have been an incredibly boring show in Canada.
Nice. All right. So if you are a GTAA patron, you should already have the post-game link. If you're not and you want to become one, patreon.com/Ben Burgis. Get these post games after regular shows on Monday, and now that we're doing the debate breakdowns again on Thursdays, access to the Discord, many other things. Most importantly, our undying love and appreciation for keeping this going. So we are going to be on that in like 2 minutes.